Donna, welcome. We are really happy to have you on the Our Time to Rise podcast talking about something we all deal with, and that is conflict. Welcome.
I'm laughing because what a topic. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be on the show with you all.
It's kind of the train wreck of a topic, right? Like people are pushing play because they have conflict with conflict. It's no one's listening who thinks, "Wow, I do this really well," and I wonder how they're going to affirm how I do this well. We're all struggling here. This is a place of struggle.
That is true. In fact, I like to say when it comes to conflict, there are 3 universal truths. We all have it, we all hate it, and we all really want to know how to handle it in a healthy way. So we're all in this together.
Yeah. And I think what's hard and tricky about it is that we may think we're handling it in a healthy way, and maybe we aren't. So we even deceive ourselves with conflict. Like it's strange, but there's all these dynamics around it. But I would just love to begin with, why is it necessary? Why is conflict actually a necessary part of life? Or otherwise, why wouldn't we just avoid it altogether?
Oh gosh, that is such a good question. Well, it's necessary because we live among people that think differently than we do, act differently than we do, want different things than we do. So it's just the nature of being human is there is going to be conflict, right? And what makes conflict good or bad is not its presence, but it's our practices in the midst of it, right? So I think it's necessary because since we live among people that are different than us or have different desires than us, then that means we got to work those through because we come at things from different perspectives. So if we don't know how to work that through, then we're going to get stuck in our relationships. And there's going to be a ceiling on how intimate we can be in our relationships, or we'll just avoid that relationship altogether. When if we would just have the skills to work through conflict, things could be so much different. And there are some people you can't avoid. You can't avoid your spouse or your kids or your in-laws or your coworkers. I mean, there are just some things that it really, really would help us in life if we just learned how to handle conflict in a way that made things turn out good.
Well, and I think about how we all want peace, but there's a difference between kind of peace as we talk about it in a more slang way, which just means the absence of conflict, and true peace, which is that settled knowing that you have been made right with someone else. And those are different things that maybe we say peace as the absence of conflict, but that doesn't necessarily mean actually that there is true peace. How would you kind of sift that sand a little bit?
Yeah. Well, first, I think when we think of peace, a lot of women especially think of keeping the peace. I just want to keep the peace. I just want peace in this house. I just want peace with my kids. I just want peace at the office, and we think of peacekeeping, but peacemaking is not the same thing as peacekeeping. So peacekeeping can mean that we avoid difficult topics or difficult conversations. We give in and we give up something of ourselves, and then we don't feel peace at all. We harbor bitterness and resentment on the inside, but on the outside, we smile and act like everything is just fine. And then we don't have peace. So we smooth over issues that are really big issues, and they end up coming back to bite us later because we didn't deal with them. I mean, there's all kinds of ramifications when we think that peacekeeping is the same as peacemaking. And we just, are these quote unquote, we buy into this quote unquote Christian notion that, we just need to keep the peace because, again, peacemaking is not the same thing as peacekeeping.
Okay. I'm feeling like I like this, like I see the difference, and And yet I'm wondering, what if I am a woman who's like, okay, maybe I want to go into that peacemaking space,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure that the person I'm in conflict with also wants to do that. How do we approach conflict when we want to be healthy, but we're not sure that the other person is going to respond in a way that's any different than our imagination, which may just be our imagination of worst case scenario?
Okay, you bring up two amazing points. So when I was doing the research for this book, Healthy Conflict, Peaceful Life, I one of the most interesting pieces of research that I found was that in conflict, we tell ourselves a story because our brains are wired to make sense of things, right? And conflict is no different. So a person says something, or they do something, or they don't do something, or they don't say something. And then our brains say, oh, she said that because, or he did that since, or, well, they must think, we attribute motives to whatever
Mhm.
happened, right? But this is so common that people do this because we are wired to make sense of things. Social scientists did a huge study on this, and they found that the stories we tell about other people's motives in conflict is only accurate 20% of the time.
Mhm.
And it only goes up to 30% if you're in a close marriage. So that means that 80% of the time, the story that we have in our heads about, well, I think I want to address this, but I don't know. What would she say? I don't know when I could, how I could, what I should say, how I would say it. All these worst case scenarios, it's only accurate 20% of the time. So that's a really important.
That's a thing. It's
Yeah,
a
that's a
thing.
thing. In fact, since I found this, my husband and I, we were driving somewhere and I started doing this. Something had happened with a neighbor and I'm like, well, and I, started all this conjecture about why I thought,
Mhm.
and I stopped myself and I said, hold on. I'm making up this whole story. This could not even be true. And so I'm
Mhm.
feeling things, saying things, could possibly do things based on the story I have in my head that may or may not be true. So that's a huge thing. The second thing is, in terms of your great question, Alex, if we want to be healthy, but we're not sure the other person does, we really cannot control another person, right?
Mhm.
And we all know that in our heads. But when we're dealing with conflict, we really have to embrace the fact that I'm only responsible for doing what's right on my end. I am not responsible for how another person responds on their end. And I learned this the hard way. So I'm going to tell you a quick little story here. And it's the opening chapter of the book, which is super vulnerable. And the opening chapter is called The Day I Wanted to Burn Down the Church. So you should know, or your listeners should know, that I'm a pastor's wife and have been for, years. Became a Christian as a child, have loved Jesus forever. And yet something happened at a church we were at, this was years ago, where somehow my husband became kind of central in some people's minds in this political game playing at this
Mhm.
particular church. And we were just like, what in the world? What is going on? I mean, we were
Mhm.
kind of outsiders that end up becoming, it was just a bizarre situation. And it was so difficult because it was so hurtful. And a lot of people were doing some sinful things. And my husband and I really, really, really tried to handle things the way Christ wanted us to handle them. But as every person knows who's ever been hurt, or their spouse has been hurt, or their child has been hurt, conflict hurts. So it's really hard to handle in a holy way. Anything that hurts is hard to handle in a holy way. But we did pretty good until one day I just was like, I just snapped. And so I met my best friend for lunch, and she leaned forward across the table when we were sure nobody would hear us. And she goes, Donna, how are you doing? And I said, oh, truthfully, some days I just want to burn down the church. And she kind of gave this nervous little laugh, and she goes, I highly recommend you don't ever repeat that out loud again, because that's a little over the top, which of course it was. And I didn't really mean it. It was just, something I said to my best friend because I was kind of venting, right? So here's what I realized. So I look back and I go, what was the mistake that I was making in that scenario that drove me to those feelings? And the mistake I made is not what you would think. The mistake I made was that I was wanting other people to change. I was wanting other people to handle things in the way we were desperately trying to handle things. And I was getting really frustrated that they weren't. And I was feeling like this isn't fair. This isn't right. This is wrong. And I realized like what was freeing to me and what actually started to give me a measure of peace in the midst of conflict when I couldn't control other people was just saying, okay, Lord, I am not responsible for them, but I am responsible for me, because I'm going to stand one day before you and I have to give an account from how I'm dealing with this. And I think that was, honestly, it was my first step of healing and freedom. And I think it's the same for all of us. Are we doing the right thing? And do we know what the right thing to do is? That's the next question.
Well, and I was thinking as you were talking, so I coach a lot of female leaders. And one of the things that is really hard for female leaders, I was just talking to someone the other day about when someone doesn't like what you are putting forward, and then there's the tendency to feel like you have to pull back and backpedal and to say, okay, it's fine, and kind of pacify the other party. But her challenge, and I think the challenge for all of us, is we are not responsible for someone else's discomfort. It's okay for someone else to be uncomfortable. And that, like you were saying, we are responsible for ourselves, how we act, how we respond, the words we use. But actually, if the other person is really uncomfortable, we don't have to back away from all that simply because they're uncomfortable. But as women, I do think this is a unique challenge. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I do too. I could not agree with you more, Krista. And I think, and it comes from a good place, because we want other people to feel good. And that is a good thing, right? But it can be used in an unhealthy way when we don't. I mean, the Bible's so clear we are to speak the truth in love, right? So a lot of us get the love part right. I want to be really loving. And so I won't speak up, or I won't say what I really think, or I'll backtrack because I don't want you to feel bad. But I think when we realize how we say things can help us speak the truth in love, if we say it with kindness, if we say it with empathy, even if, Krista, if we say things like, this is such an awkward conversation. It's awkward for me, and I know it's awkward for you. Or, gosh, I'd feel uncomfortable too if I were hearing that. We empathize. That puts us on the same team as the other person. And I like to say that the best way to handle conflict is not me against you. It's me and you against the problem. So anytime you can put yourself on the same side as the person, even if it's emotionally, like, that would be a terrible way to feel. Or, maybe it's with our child. I hate my nagging. I hate my nagging over your homework. I bet you hate my nagging over your homework too. See, that puts us on the same side of the situation. And then that tees us up to say, okay, we both hate my nagging. What can we do about it? So that is a huge piece of beginning a hard conversation in a healthy, soft way. That
I really like that because it makes the problem the central feature as opposed to the person as the central
exactly.
feature. And that's a really good distinction to say, okay, we want to make the problem the thing that we're tackling together, not like you are not the problem. You know, it's more of this situation. And I think as we look at, you know, as people of faith, we do want to do things differently than the world does. We do want to act differently. We do want to use different words, a different posture, because we want to carry humility. We want to carry kindness. We want to carry patience. And yet it's hard. It's a high call. So as people of faith, I mean, how do you encourage, I feel like you're getting to it, but how do you encourage us to kind of rework our scripts a little bit so that we can be that within conflict and still have it?
Yes, that's such a good question. And interestingly, again, just, you know, writing this book and looking at all the passages of scripture that dealt with conflict or communication or listening, there are so many, and the book is filled with them, by the way, because Jesus really cares about how we handle conflict. Because Jesus cares that his kids are unified. I mean, that's John chapter 17. He prayed for our unity, right? And you know, and there's so many passages of scripture. I mean, even Jesus said, if your brother or sister sins against you, you know, go to them privately and point out their fault. If they listen to you, they've won them over. That's not just church discipline. That's also just when your brother or sister sins against you, just, you know, go to them quickly and just privately. I like to say, you don't talk about a person, you talk to the person. And we tend to get that messed up. We end up talking about people rather than to people because we want to avoid the situation. Or we think, well, if I say something to so-and-so, maybe they'll say something to the person and I don't have to. Or we think,
The scapegoat.
well, why should I have to say anything anyway? Shouldn't they just know? So there's all kinds of ways we get around in our minds, we rationalize not doing what Jesus told us to do. And then we end up with this lack of peace and we end up with bigger conflicts than if we just, you know, the minute something happened and it was a small thing, approaching someone and assuming the best, not assuming the worst, right? Hey, I know you may not have known this or you may not have met this, or, you know, I'm sure you want a good working environment as much as I do, or, you know, babe, I love you. And I know you want the best marriage just like I do. You know, you come at it from a place where it makes the person's defenses diffused. And then you do this privately. And then you just point out, you know, the issue. And interestingly, when Jesus said point out their fault is singular, not plural. So it's
That's
one
good.
thing, right? And we tend to wait and we tend to let things build up until we can't take it one more minute. And then we just dump truck 40 grievances on someone. And that just does not go well, right? That just makes conflict worse rather than better. So if we just went to the person, pointed out the one thing, worked it through, we're on the same side, you're not the problem, the problem's the problem, you know, the likelihood that we can work it through is greatly increased.
Yes. Well, I love the answer. And I do have a clarifying question.
Yes.
So let's take young adult children, for example, because I think we have them. A lot of our listeners have them. And we as parents have to discern, when do we bring something up and when do we not? So we don't want to have the dump truck, but we also don't want to be the nitpick that every time they do something that maybe causes us internal stress, we bring it up. What is the filter? And you said something that I think might help, but what is the filter for knowing this is something that comes to the level of bringing up, or this is something I just need to work through on my own? Or the practice of, this is not my thing to carry. Like, I need to bless and release on this. And it, just because it bothers me doesn't mean I should bring it up. Feelings.
Yeah, that's such a good question, especially I have young adults too, and I know a lot of your listeners do. So there's a chapter in the book called Should I Be Mad?
Mm-hmm.
Big things to small things and everything in between. And that whole chapter talks about this very issue. And I like to say that conflicts come in 3 different forms, if you will. So there are irritations,
Mm-hmm.
there are insults, and
Mm-hmm.
there are, oh gosh, no, I didn't know we were going to talk about this. Let's see, irritations, insults, and oh, I'll think of it in just a second. It's a third eye. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, so an irritation is just a little thing that, you know, oh gosh, they left their room a mess again, right? They
Mm-hmm.
left the dishes in the sink rather than putting them in the dishwasher. So those are small things. There are insults, which is something where something's disrespectful. That's a bigger thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the third is issues.
Mm-hmm.
And those are bigger things. Like this is an ongoing issue. So the filter that we use is this, whether we should address it or not, is this a one-time thing or an ongoing thing? Is this something that would harm the relationship over time if it continues? And those are the 2 biggest filters, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, if it's a one-time thing, you just let it go. If it's something that's not really going to impact your relationship, you let it go. It's just not the hill to die on.
Right.
But if this is like, if I don't say something, this is going to affect our relationship. Now, you said something interestingly. You said some things are not ours to carry. And I actually wrote an Instagram post yesterday, and I I got so many comments on this Instagram post. I was like, whoa, this was way more helpful than I ever even thought it would be. And it was actually a quote from the book, and then I went on to expand it. And the quote from the book is, we are not obligated to become enmeshed in someone else's emotional mess.
Yes.
And one of the things that I said in that, in my explanation of that particular quote is that we cannot carry, or we should not carry, what we cannot control.
Mm-hmm.
So there comes a time when we have young adult children, and we have to, and this is a hard thing because we're used to controlling, because we're moms and we've been in charge for 18 plus years. So now we have to let go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to ask ourselves, wait, is this my responsibility? Do I actually have a measure of control over this?
Mm-hmm.
If I don't, I can't carry what I can't control. And I am not obligated to become enmeshed in somebody else's emotional mess. So,
and that applies to that leader too. I think about it applies to kids. It applies to that leader. It applies to all situations.
Yeah. And it's interesting because this book, there is not a single relationship that this does not apply to. There's not honestly, every relationship a listener has, it will apply to their relationships.
It's good. Okay. Well, I want to get into some of the communication flaws we may have. And, we can talk about blaming, exaggeration, but I really want you to really go to the big culprits. Like, what are the big culprits that we all use and that we all need to be avoiding?
Okay. So I'm going to start off with this. This will change your life. I promise you.
Okay, I'm listening, Donna. I am listening very closely.
So when it comes to conflict, what we tend to go to in our mind is, okay, now what do I need to say? What's the right thing to say? What's the right thing to do? Right? The best thing to do in conflict is not something you say. The best thing to do in conflict is something you do, and it's listen. Listen first. Now, here's why. is because when we are in conflict is usually, well, always, I will say, has big emotions behind it, right? Some of us express those big emotions. Some of us repress those big emotions, but somewhere there's some big emotions when there's conflict, right? So what we tend to do is if somebody has big emotions with us, our kids, our coworker, our husband, we tend to, we don't like that. So we just want to stop it as fast as we can. So sometimes we'll dismiss it like, oh, get over it. That's okay. That's just not that big of a deal. Or again, are you kidding me? Or I don't have time for this right now. Or we try to fix it. Well, I had that same situation. And what I did was, or if I were you, or have you tried this? So we'll dismiss it. We'll fix it. We'll minimize it. It's not that big of a deal. Or we'll spiritualize it. Jesus doesn't want us to have that attitude. Jesus wants us to forgive. Jesus wants us to love. Jesus wants, and all of those things, they're not wrong in and of themselves. But when we don't lead with listening, when we lead with trying to fix or dismiss or excuse or whatever, this is what happens in the other person's brain. And it also, by the way, happens in our brain too, if we are trying to express big emotions. When we're in conflict, what we really want is to be understood. That's what we really want. So when somebody's trying to express something, if we don't listen, then what they will do is they will ramp it up. They will escalate it. And in their mind, they're thinking, well, she's not getting it right now because she's dismissing it or she's trying to fix it. So I'm going to escalate this thing by getting louder, getting more dramatic, slamming a door, walking out, crossing my arms and giving her the silent treatment. I'm going to escalate this. Then maybe she'll finally understand why I'm so upset about this. And if we still don't, they escalate it more and more and more until finally something clicks and they go, forget it. Just forget it. She'll never get it. You'll never get it. I'm done. And then we say things like, no, tell me what you really think, no, forget it. So conflicts in the absence of listening escalate or they end always. Well, we don't want conflicts to escalate and we really don't want them to end poorly. So the biggest thing we can do is when someone is expressing these big emotions to us is just listen and listen with empathy. And here's the thing I think that sidetracks us is that sometimes we think that listening equals understanding.
Exactly.
Listening equals
Agreeing.
Agreement. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Listening does not equal agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Listening equals understanding. So you can still disagree, but listen to understand why they feel, why they think, what they think, etc. What that does is it diffuses those big emotions. It makes someone feel understood. And then now when you finally do speak, well, the person is not, they're not as upset as they were before. They're calmed down without us having to say, would you calm down? Which, side note, never calms anybody down, right? So they're calm. And now we can actually express what we think, and the likelihood that they will listen to us because we listen to them is greatly increased.
Yeah.
So that's why leading with listening is the single most important thing we can do in the middle of conflict.
Absolutely. I always go back to the Gottman blueprint, the Gottman Institute out of Seattle, and they have that blueprint to follow, which I think is helpful because this is harder to do than it sounds.
Yeah.
Because we immediately go to fixing. We immediately go to, that's not what I meant. That's not how it went. That's not my interpretation of how the scenario went down. This is actually in practice really hard. And so
Yes.
I find that blueprint helpful because it's almost like a structure outside of the two of you that you're like, okay, we're following the structure. We're going to, because it is a discipline. I find it to be more of a discipline in that moment because like I said, it's the emotions are high. And so you automatically go to that spot.
Yeah, you are exactly right. This is not easy. But what's really interesting is in James 1, it says, let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So it's really interesting that in the Bible, listening and being slow to speak is in that same verse with anger. So these are all linked together. And then it says, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. So when we don't listen, we end up it's the anger of man, and that's not a holy kind of anger. But you are exactly right. It is not easy. It is a discipline. It is a choice.
So I would love to hear about different types of people in conflict. And this is something I know because I'm a DISC coach. And actually, this is something that I study is who's conflict avoidant, who's more apt to go straight into conflict, and what do you do with those types? Because you've got the real direct kind, you've got the avoidant kind, and everywhere in between. And so how do you help people with the extremes? People who have a tendency to be more aggressive, and then those who tend to be more avoidant.
Okay, that's such a good question. You may even know more about this than I do. So I'm going to lay that out there, Krista. But two things. In the book, I talk about there's a conflict continuum. So this is just a simple first step. So if you can imagine a straight line, with an arrow pointing in either direction, on one side of that continuum are people that are avoiders. And they're the type of people that are like, I just want to keep the peace, at all costs. On the other side of that continuum are what I call the attackers. And they're just like, let's go, baby. I'm in it. And it'll win it, right? Neither of those is healthy or Christ-like. There's a sweet spot in the middle called the addressers. So where we don't avoid and we don't attack, we address. That's what we all want to shoot for. That's where we're going. So that being said, just knowing, okay, you can first start off saying, am I an avoider or am I more of an attacker? Or am I more of an addresser? Is my spouse, my kids, my coworkers, where are they on that continuum? Then actually in the book, there are 6 different types of conflict styles. And so you can find out what your conflict is. On my website, I have a quiz. It's like a 2-minute quiz, and you can find out what your conflict style is. And then you'll see like a little video that I recorded to say, hey, your conflict style is, and I'll tell you the strengths of that conflict style, the weaknesses of that conflict style, and one thing you can do to move forward to being more healthy in the way you handle conflict. Because we do have different conflict styles largely based on our personalities and our upbringing. So I do think it's helpful. This was so funny, Krista, as I was formulating the quiz for this, and Alex, I took my family members and I had them take the quiz. And it was so insightful. My daughter is getting married in a week and a half, and her fiance was with us. And so, I really didn't know his conflict style. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting because that will help our family know, oh, this is the way he deals with conflict, or help my daughter know this is the way he deals with conflict. So just knowing how we deal with conflict, knowing how other people deal with conflict can be immensely helpful.
Would you say someone is the same in all situations, or they tend to, like in your marriage, you might feel more comfortable, so you might be a little more direct, whereas at work you might pull back?
Yes, absolutely. I would say yes. It depends. It's situation dependent. However, I think our personalities lean toward one or the other, but it can be situational. So what would you say, Krista, since you're a DISC expert?
Yeah, I think certain personality types are always going to be avoidant in every arena, and some are going to be always more dominant. And then there's, like I said, everywhere in between. So it is hard. It is based on the individual, and it also is based on what that individual sees around them. Because if there's someone else like in the workplace who's really conflict driven, they may actually become more of a buffer, which isn't good either. That's not healthy either, but they may immediately go, okay, I'm going into buffer zone because that person is always aggressive. And so then they're pulling back, but they really need to come forward and actually model that healthy conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Which that other person is most likely not doing. So anyway, I could go on and I won't, but yeah, it's a little bit, it is situational sometimes, and people are on a spectrum of how comfortable they are moving into conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
So Donna, as we close today, we are our time to rise. I mean, this is our time to rise. We are encouraging people to rise up to the challenges in front of them, and conflict is one of those. And so how would you encourage people to rise up to healthy conflict?
Such a good question. Well, we live in a world in 2024 when conflict is all around us, right? I mean, we're going into an election year here. So conflict that we haven't even thought about is about to happen. So it's interesting that this book is coming out in this year. I really feel like there's a divine purpose behind that, because God wants his children, his church, to know how to deal with conflict in a healthy way. And I feel like we need to get out in front of it and know what to do, what not to do. And that one of the ways we rise is by being equipped. And, the subtitle of this book is A Biblical Guide to Communicating Thoughts, Feelings, and Opinions with Grace, Truth, and Zero Regret. And every time I have ever said the subtitle to someone, they nod their head and they go, oh my gosh, that's what I need. Right. And me too. That's why I wrote the book. I'm a fellow journeyer in this thing. And I think if we can rise up, because conflict is just going to be a part of life. It's not like we can make it go away. That would be option A, but that's heaven. So since we have to live in option B, real life, the way we rise up is to know how to handle it in a God-honoring way, that we don't have to hang our head in shame and go, why did I handle it that way? So that's how I think we can rise.
Yeah, so great. And I love what you talked about. It's really equipping ourselves ahead of time so that we're not trying to figure it out in the middle of the conflict. We're actually equipping ourselves going into conflict, and we make those pre-decisions ahead of time. So smart and so wise. Thank you, Donna. This is an important topic, and we just wish you the best with your book.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Alex.
Yes.
It was such a joy to be with you.